The intricate web of global commerce often finds its most profound impacts felt not in the high-rise offices of coastal metropolises, but within the sprawling acreage of the American Heartland. During a recent legislative inquiry, Senator Fischer meticulously parsed the multifaceted economic fallout stemming from aggressive trade tariffs and the shifting landscape of international agricultural pacts specifically as they relate to the state of Nebraska. It is a reality where the geopolitical posturing of world powers translates directly into the ledger sheets of family-owned farms and local equipment manufacturers. While the senator was quick to convey a sense of appreciation for the federal relief packages that have acted as a critical safety net for many rural communities, she pointedly noted that financial aid is merely a temporary bridge rather than a sustainable destination. There is an undeniable tension in the air as agricultural producers remain in a state of high alert, awaiting more than just bureaucratic promises. These producers are looking toward the horizon, specifically toward the east, with a growing sense of urgency for China to finally make good on its highly publicized commitments. The expectation remains firm that Beijing must follow through on the purchase of millions of metric tons of soybeans, an influx of trade that would stabilize a volatile market. However, the ripple effects of these trade maneuvers do not stop at the edge of a soybean field. They penetrate deep into the machinery of American industrial output. The current climate has revealed a stark and widening chasm within the manufacturing sector, creating a dynamic of winners and losers defined by their position in the supply chain. On one side of the divide, certain domestic industries have found a renewed sense of security and growth under the umbrella of protective trade policies. These entities have capitalized on the reduced competition from foreign imports, allowing them to recapture market share and reinvest in local labor. Yet, for every factory finding its footing, another faces the crushing weight of skyrocketing input costs for raw materials like steel and aluminum. This escalation in production expenses has placed many venerable firms in an untenable position, forcing leadership to contemplate the grim reality of significant workforce reductions. The threat of layoffs hangs like a heavy mist over industrial towns where a single plant often serves as the economic heartbeat of the entire region. To remain viable on the global stage, these embattled manufacturers are signaling a desperate need for nuanced policy adjustments that address the friction points of current trade barriers. There is a collective outcry for strategic remedies that can bypass the unintended negative consequences that often accompany broad-brush economic restrictions. The dialogue has consequently shifted toward the Department of Commerce, which finds itself at the center of a complex balancing act. The agency is tasked with navigating these choppy waters by fostering an environment that is once again attractive to foreign direct investment. By incentivizing international capital to flow back into American soil, the hope is to revitalize the domestic industrial base from the ground up. Simultaneously, there is a coordinated push to relocate critical supply chains back within our sovereign borders to ensure national resilience. This reshoring initiative is seen as a vital defense against future global shocks and a way to reclaim the manufacturing prowess that once defined the American economy. The conversation between the Republican and Democratic representatives highlights a shared concern for the American worker, even if their proposed paths to prosperity occasionally diverge. Senator Fischer emphasizes the necessity of market access and the sanctity of trade agreements, arguing that Nebraska's farmers are the most efficient in the world when the playing field is level. She contends that while federal subsidies have prevented a total collapse, the dignity of the American producer is found in the harvest and the sale, not in a government check. On the opposing side, a democratic perspective might focus more heavily on the structural inequalities that left these sectors vulnerable to begin with. They argue that trade policy must be paired with aggressive labor protections and a tax code that doesn't reward corporations for offshoring jobs. Despite these ideological differences, both sides concede that the status quo is unsustainable for the small-scale producer caught in the crossfire of a trade war. The objective remains a delicate equilibrium when national security interests do not inadvertently bankrupt the very people they are meant to protect. The volatility of the current market has turned the kitchen table into a boardroom for many Nebraska families, as they calculate the cost of seeds against the fluctuating price of global commodities. Every delay in Chinese fulfillment of trade quotas represents more than just a line item on a trade report. It represents missed mortgage payments and delayed equipment upgrades. The reliance on federal intervention, while necessary, has sparked a deeper debate about the long-term health of the American agricultural soul. Critics and proponents alike asking how long a sector can thrive on emergency injections of capital without the underlying health of free and fair trade. There is a palpable sense that the patience of the heartland is wearing thin as the timeline for Phase 1 agreements continues to stretch. The agricultural sector is demanding a return to normalcy, where the quality of their product determines their success rather than the shifting whims of international diplomacy. In the industrial corridors, the sentiment is equally fraught with complexity, as the cost of doing business becomes a moving target. Small to mid-sized manufacturers, often the backbone of local economies, find themselves squeezed between the high cost of protected domestic materials and the competitive pricing of finished foreign goods. This input-output trap has led to a stagnation in innovation, as capital that could have been spent on research and development is instead diverted to cover the rising costs of raw metal. The fear is that a prolonged period of high tariffs will lead to a permanent erosion of the American manufacturing footprint. If these companies cannot compete on price, they may be forced to shutter their doors, leaving behind a vacuum that is rarely filled. Therefore, the call for surgical trade policy, rather than a blunt force approach, is becoming louder among those who actually manage the factory floors. They argue that protectionism must be precise to avoid becoming a self-inflicted wound that cripples the very industries it sought to shield. The role of the Department of Commerce has never been more scrutinized as they attempt to bridge the gap between national policy and local reality. Their efforts to attract foreign investment are seen as a silver lining, potentially bringing new technology and high-paying jobs to regions that have felt left behind by the digital revolution. However, the process of bringing supply chains back to the United States is a Herculean task that requires more than just rhetoric. It requires a massive overhaul of infrastructure, a focused effort on vocational training, and a regulatory environment that encourages long-term domestic growth. The transition from a globalized, just-in-time supply model to a more localized, resilient one is fraught with logistical hurdles. Yet, the consensus is growing that the risks of over-reliance on foreign adversaries for critical components are far too high to ignore. This shift represents a fundamental rethinking of what it means to be an economically sovereign nation in the 21st century. As we look toward the next fiscal quarter, the focus remains on whether these diplomatic overtures will yield tangible results for the American worker. The tension between the desire for protective barriers and the need for open markets continues to define the current political era. For the people of Nebraska and the broader Midwest, the stakes could not be higher, as their livelihoods are inextricably linked to the resolution of these grand economic debates. The hope is that through rigorous legislative oversight and a commitment to pragmatic solutions, a path forward can be found. This path must honor the contributions of the American farmer and manufacturer, while ensuring they have the tools to compete and win in a global economy. The dialogue initiated by leaders like Senator Fischer serves as a crucial reminder that economic policy is, at its heart, about people and their ability to build a future. Only through a balanced approach can we hope to achieve a stable and prosperous economic landscape for generations to come. The current fiscal climate in Nebraska has created a paradoxical reality where the traditional metrics of success are being rewritten by geopolitical friction and federal intervention. Senator Fischer, in her continued advocacy for the agricultural community, has pointed to a bridge of federal support that, while life-saving, highlights a deeper systemic fragility. In late 2025, the rollout of massive bridge payments, a component of the broader American Relief Act, provided a critical lifeline, injecting billions into a state economy that remains heavily dependent on the unpredictable winds of trade. For many Nebraska producers, these payments have meant the difference between preparing for the 2026 planting season and facing total insolvency. However, there is a shared understanding that these infusions of capital are a temporary palliative for a sector that would much rather earn its revenue through open and competitive global markets. The senator remains vocal that the ultimate goal is not a permanent subsidy regime, but a return to a landscape where the America First legacy is solidified through the actual movement of physical goods across borders. A primary point of contention remains the Phase 2 commitments from Beijing, which have become a focal point of both hope and skepticism. While recent agreements have outlined a path for China to purchase 25 million metric tons of soybeans annually through 2028, the transition from paper promises to actual cargo ships at sea has been agonizingly slow. This delay has significant real-world implications, as soybean receipts in Nebraska were projected to dip by nearly 7% in late 2025 due to the absence of consistent Chinese demand. Senator Fischer has emphasized that for these international agreements to be more than just political theater, they must result in tangible results for the growers in the Platte River Valley. The frustration is palpable among farmers who see their competitors in Brazil and Argentina capturing larger shares of the Asian market while American production sits in storage. There is a growing demand for the administration to leverage every diplomatic tool available to ensure that these historic deals are strictly enforced and that American agriculture is not used as a perpetual bargaining chip. On the other side of the aisle, figures like Senator Sherrod Brown approach the trade dilemma from a perspective rooted in the dignity of work and the protection of the industrial labor force. From the Democratic viewpoint, the trade wars of the mid-2020s have exposed the inherent risks of a policy that pits different segments of the American economy against one another. Brown argues that while Nebraska's farmers are suffering under the weight of retaliatory measures, Ohio's factory workers are simultaneously being squeezed by the rising costs of the very materials needed to keep their plants running. The Democratic stance often critiques the current tariff regime for being a blunt force instrument that lacks the precision necessary to protect domestic jobs without triggering a cascade of unintended layoffs. They contend that any trade strategy must be integrated with robust labor standards and environmental protections to prevent a race to the bottom where American workers are forced to compete with exploited labor overseas. The internal divide within the manufacturing sector has become increasingly visible as we move into 2026, with small-scale producers bearing the brunt of the economic shift. In the industrial parks of the Midwest, the cost of raw materials, driven higher by protective barriers, has forced a radical shift in business strategy. Many manufacturers are no longer looking at expansion but are instead focused on survival mode, prioritizing debt management over innovation or new equipment. This stagnation is particularly concerning for the Department of Commerce, which is attempting to sell a narrative of a domestic manufacturing renaissance. While some large-scale operations have successfully reshored certain aspects of their supply chain, the smaller shops that make up the backbone of the industrial ecosystem are finding the input-output trap nearly impossible to navigate. The specter of significant workforce reductions in early 2026 remains a haunting possibility for communities that have only just begun to recover from previous economic shocks. Legislative efforts like the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, OBBBA, have attempted to address these concerns by restructuring federal support for a new era of global competition. This legislation has significantly increased reference prices for major commodities like corn and soybeans, providing a higher level of price protection for growers starting in the 2026 crop year. For a Nebraska farmer, this means a shift in the safety net, moving from ad hoc emergency checks to a more formalized system of price loss coverage. Senator Fischer has championed these changes as a way to provide long-term stability and predictability, allowing producers to plan their operations with a clearer understanding of their potential revenue. Yet, the Democratic critique remains that these measures primarily benefit the largest operations and may not adequately address the rising production expenses that continue to climb to record highs. They argue for a more holistic approach that includes investment in rural infrastructure and vocational training to ensure that the next generation of Nebraskans can thrive in a changing global economy. The role of biofuels, particularly the push for year-round E15 sales, has emerged as a rare point of potential bipartisan cooperation in the quest for market stability. Senator Fischer has long argued that expanding the domestic market for corn-based ethanol is one of the most effective ways to reduce reliance on volatile foreign exports. By creating a permanent, nationwide market for cleaner, American-made fuels, the hope is to drive new revenue into rural communities and lower costs at the pump for families. This initiative is seen as a way to fuel and feed the nation while simultaneously providing an outlet for the massive surpluses that often depress prices during a trade standoff. For the Nebraska economy, where corn is king, the success of the biofuel market is inextricably linked to the state's overall financial health. This domestic focus represents a strategic pivot toward self-reliance, ensuring that the prosperity of the heartland is not entirely dependent on the whims of a central planning committee in a foreign capital. As the Department of Commerce works to facilitate foreign investment, the focus is increasingly on critical supply chains that have long been outsourced to adversarial nations. The goal is to create a domestic ecosystem where the raw materials, the processing, and the final assembly all take place on American soil. This is a massive logistical undertaking that requires a coordinated effort between the federal government, state leaders, and private industry. The promise of new high-tech manufacturing jobs in the Midwest is a powerful incentive, but the transition period is fraught with challenges. The need to avoid recession-level employment shocks while the economy realigns itself is a primary concern for policymakers on both sides of the aisle. The dialogue initiated by Senator Fischer serves as a stark reminder that while the macroeconomic numbers might show growth, the microeconomic reality for a family in rural Nebraska or an industrial town in Ohio is far more nuanced. The focus for 2026 remains on achieving a delicate equilibrium between national security and economic vitality. The question is no longer whether we should protect American interests, but how we do so without dismantling the very markets that sustain our prosperity. For the farmers waiting on the next shipment of soybeans and the factory workers watching the price of steel, the debate in Washington is far from abstract. It is a daily negotiation with the future of their families and their communities. Only by addressing the unintended consequences of our current trade barriers can we hope to build an economy that is both resilient and competitive. The path forward requires a level of pragmatic cooperation that transcends partisan rhetoric, focusing instead on the tangible results that will define the American economic legacy for the next decade. As we navigate the opening months of 2026, the domestic manufacturing sector has become the primary theater for testing the efficacy of America First economic insulation. Senator Fischer has consistently argued that the short-term pain of trade barriers is a necessary prerequisite for long-term national sovereignty. Yet the data from late 2025 paints a picture of a sector under extreme duress. The Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, PMI, has hovered in contraction territory for much of the past year, signaling that the engine of American industry is struggling to find its footing amidst the shifting gears of global trade. For the smaller tool and die shops and equipment manufacturers in the Midwest, the primary antagonist is no longer just foreign competition, but the sheer cost of the raw materials required to stay in business. The 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum, which were expanded in early 2025, have created a price ceiling that many domestic firms simply cannot break through. While these measures were intended to bolster the primary metals industry, the downstream effect has been a margin squeeze that threatens to hollow out the mid-tier manufacturing base that Nebraska and its neighbors rely on for stable employment. The debate between Fischer and Brown intensifies when examining the specific human cost of these industrial shifts, particularly the specter of manufacturing layoffs that began to accelerate in the fourth quarter of 2025. Senator Brown has been vocal in his critique, pointing out that since the April 2025 tariff announcements, durable goods manufacturers, those producing the cars, appliances, and heavy machinery that define American life, have seen a net loss of nearly 60,000 jobs. From the Democratic perspective, the current policy has inadvertently penalized the very workers it claimed to champion by creating a whiplash effect of unpredictable pricing. When the cost of a steel beam or a specialized aluminum alloy increases by double digits overnight, the first thing to be sacrificed is often the payroll. Brown argues that without a more surgical application of trade barriers, the nation risks a permanent erosion of its skilled labor force, as younger workers increasingly view the manufacturing sector as too volatile for a stable career. This employment shock is particularly acute in communities where a single plant closure can decimate the local tax base and lead to a generational decline in prosperity. Conversely, the Republican stance, often articulated through Fischer's focus on long-term resilience, maintains that these disruptions are the inevitable friction of a massive and necessary economic realignment. The Department of Commerce has doubled down on its mission to foster critical supply chain resiliency, an effort reinforced by the Promoting Resilient Supply Chains Act of 2025. This legislation aims to institutionalize a crisis response program within the government, ensuring that the United States is never again caught flat-footed by a global pandemic or a geopolitical blockade. For Fischer, the goal is to move beyond the just-in-time supply models that prioritize cheap foreign labor over national security. By incentivizing the reshoring of vital components, from semiconductors to rare earth magnets, the administration hopes to build a fortress economy that can withstand external shocks. This vision involves not just bringing back old jobs, but creating entirely new industries rooted in smart manufacturing and high-tech automation that can compete globally without relying on a low-wage workforce. A cornerstone of this reshoring effort is the ongoing implementation of the CHIPS and Science Act, which as of mid-2025 had already awarded over $30 billion to dozens of domestic projects. While the completion of a major logic chip facility in Arizona in June 2025 was hailed as a monumental victory, the rollout in the Midwest has been more gradual. The Department of Commerce is currently managing a backlog of applications totaling over $70 billion, highlighting an immense appetite for domestic investment that currently outstrips federal funding. Senator Fischer has advocated for the integration of these high-tech initiatives with the traditional agricultural base, envisioning a future where Nebraska-grown bioplastics and biolubricants are manufactured in the same regions where they are harvested. This synergy between the field and the factory is seen as a way to diversify the rural economy and provide a buffer against the boom and bust cycles of international commodity trading. Yet, the challenge remains. Can these high-tech investments arrive fast enough to offset the job losses in traditional manufacturing sectors? The passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, OBBBA, in late 2025 has provided another layer to this industrial puzzle, introducing significant tax incentives for domestic research and development. By allowing for 100% bonus depreciation and immediate R&D expensing, the bill attempts to lower the total cost of ownership for companies looking to move production back to American soil. However, the efficacy of these tax breaks is often blunted by the very tariffs that the bill was meant to support. A manufacturer might receive a generous tax credit for a new piece of automated equipment, only to find that the equipment itself costs 15% more because it contains specialized components still only available from overseas. This tax and tariff paradox has led to a stagnant period of capital investment, where firms are hesitant to pull the trigger on major expansions while the legal authority of certain trade measures is being challenged in the Supreme Court. The resulting uncertainty has become a significant headwind for the Department of Commerce as they attempt to lure foreign direct investment into the American heartland. In this environment, the role of smart manufacturing, incorporating AI, sensors, and advanced robotics, is seen as the only viable path forward for a high-wage economy. Industry experts suggest that the successful firms of 2026 will be those that can use technology to offset the higher costs of domestic labor and materials. However, this transition requires a massive investment in workforce development, a point where Senators Fischer and Brown find rare common ground. Both acknowledge that reshoring cannot succeed if there isn't a pipeline of skilled technicians capable of operating a modern, digitized factory floor. The Department of Commerce has increasingly tied its incentive awards to localized training programs, yet the skills gap remains a formidable barrier. For a town in Nebraska or Ohio, the challenge is not just bringing the factory back, but ensuring that the local high school and community college can produce the workers needed to staff it. Without this human infrastructure, the physical infrastructure of reshoring will remain underutilized. As the legislative session progresses, the focus is turning towards surgical adjustments to the current trade regime. There is growing pressure to exempt certain non-substitutable inputs from broad tariffs, materials that are critical for American production but cannot yet be sourced domestically in sufficient quantities. This approach seeks to find the Goldilocks zone of trade policy, strong enough to protect domestic industry and national security, but flexible enough to avoid crippling the manufacturers who rely on global supply chains. Senator Fischer's office has been inundated with requests from local businesses seeking relief from specific tariff classifications that have become existential threats. The outcome of these negotiations will determine whether the manufacturing renaissance of the late 2020s is a broad-based revival or a narrow victory for a few well-protected industries. The stakes for the American worker remain high, as the nation attempts to redefine its industrial identity in an increasingly fractured world. The tension between protectionism and productivity continues to define the economic discourse of 2026. For every successful reshoring story, there is a counter-narrative of a small shop struggling to keep the lights on as costs soar. The mission for the Department of Commerce is to turn these disparate threads into a cohesive industrial strategy that serves the interests of both the farmer in Nebraska and the machinist in Ohio. The dialogue is no longer about whether to engage with the global economy, but on what terms that engagement will take place. As the sun sets on the first quarter of the year, the heartland remains in a state of watchful waiting, hoping that the promises of a resilient, self-sufficient America can be realized without sacrificing the prosperity that trade has historically provided. The path to a new American industrial era is being paved with both high-tech chips and traditional steel, and its success will depend on the ability of leaders to navigate the complex trade-offs of a world in transition. The administrative engine in Washington is currently operating under a 2022 to 2026 strategic plan that has redefined the Department of Commerce as a central node for economic and national security. Senator Fischer, during the recent legislative oversight, pointed to the department's Supply Chain Center as a vital tool for preventing the next systemic collapse of the American marketplace. This center, utilizing the innovative Scale tool, is now analyzing real-time trade data to identify structural risks before they manifest in empty shelves or shuttered plants. For a state like Nebraska, this means the federal government is no longer just a passive observer of trade, but a proactive analyst tracking the flow of critical components that power everything from tractors to medical devices. While Fischer remains appreciative of this defensive posture, She has pushed the department to move beyond risk assessment and into active market creation. The goal is to ensure that when a supply chain is reshored, it is done so in a way that attracts long-term foreign direct investment, FDI, into the heartland rather than just the coastal tech hubs. The friction in the debate arises from the department's dual role as both a gatekeeper and an ambassador for American industry. Under the direction of the International Trade Administration, there is an aggressive effort to lure high-value FDI that supports domestic production capacity, particularly in sectors like biotechnology and AI-driven logistics. Senator Brown has often questioned whether these investments truly benefit the American worker or simply provide a tax-advantaged foothold for multinational corporations. The Democratic perspective emphasizes that for FDI to be meaningful, it must come with strings attached, specifically guarantees for local hiring, living wages, and union protections. Brown argues that if the Department of Commerce is going to use federal resources to attract foreign capital, that capital must be anchored to the community. He remains skeptical of greenfield investments that might evaporate as soon as a more favorable tax environment appears elsewhere, advocating instead for deep-rooted partnerships that revitalize existing industrial centers in the Rust Belt and the Great Plains. To counter these concerns, the Department of Commerce has leveraged Select USA, a program designed to facilitate high-impact foreign investment by cutting through the regulatory red tape that often deters international firms. In late 2025, this initiative successfully brokered a deal for a multi-million-dollar cable manufacturing facility in the South, which is slated to begin operations in mid-2026. For Senator Fischer, these success stories are evidence that the America First framework can coexist with global engagement if the terms are right. She maintains that the best way to secure a supply chain is to own the ground it sits on, converting foreign capital into American infrastructure and American paychecks. By focusing on critical minerals and foundational technologies, the department is attempting to build a domestic ecosystem that is insulated from the influence of adversaries. This includes a strategic focus on rare earth elements and battery-grade lithium, ensuring that the transition to a more electrified economy does not trade one form of foreign dependency for another. The legislative landscape of 2026 is also being shaped by the upcoming review of the USMCA, United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, a process that both Fischer and Brown view as a critical juncture for North American trade. The Department of Commerce is currently leading the joint review preparations, focusing on how to align the three nations' investment rules to discourage offshoring to low-wage jurisdictions. This regional approach to reshoring, often called nearshoring, is seen as a pragmatic compromise for industries that require a level of cost competitiveness that purely domestic production cannot always provide. For a Nebraska producer, the stability of the North American market is paramount, as Mexico and Canada remain among the state's largest trading partners. Fischer has advocated for a North American fortress approach, where the continent functions as a self-sustaining economic bloc capable of competing with any other global power. Yet, the challenge remains to ensure that nearshoring to Mexico doesn't inadvertently siphon jobs away from American towns like Kearney or Grand Island. The implementation of the Promoting Resilient Supply Chains Act has introduced a new level of interagency coordination, involving the Departments of State and Commerce in a form of supply chain diplomacy. This involves working with allies through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity to diversify sourcing networks away from high-risk regions. For the agricultural sector, this diplomacy is vital for opening new markets for Nebraska's grain and beef as a hedge against Chinese volatility. Senator Fischer has emphasized that while the domestic focus is primary, American agriculture is a global powerhouse that needs global outlets. The Department of Commerce's role in facilitating these minilateral trade deals is seen as a way to bypass the gridlock of traditional massive trade pacts. By focusing on specific sectors, like agricultural technology or specialty chemicals, the administration hopes to create a more agile and responsive trade policy that can adapt to the rapid shifts of the 2026 global economy. However, the unintended consequences of this assertive trade posture continue to ripple through the manufacturing sector. As the Department of Commerce ramps up its anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations to protect domestic firms, the retaliatory actions from foreign governments can sometimes catch American exporters in the crossfire. This economic tit-for-tat has led to a climate where business leaders are often more concerned with the next Federal Register notice than with their own production schedules. Senator Brown has called for a trade adjustment assistance program that is better funded and more responsive to the workers who lose their jobs as a direct result of these trade maneuvers. He argues that if the nation is going to engage in an economic war for industrial supremacy, it must treat its workers like the essential personnel they are, providing robust support for those caught in the transition. This focus on inclusive capitalism is a central pillar of the democratic trade vision, contrasting with the more market-centric approach of the Republican platform. The role of technology in this supply chain reset cannot be overstated, with the Department of Commerce investing heavily in smart ports and automated logistics. By reducing the transit friction that currently hampers American exports, the goal is to make domestic products more competitive on the global stage despite higher labor costs. For Nebraska, where logistics are a significant portion of the cost for heavy agricultural machinery, these improvements are a welcome development. Senator Fischer has highlighted that resiliency isn't just about where things are made, but how efficiently they move. The 2026 fiscal year is expected to see a surge in federal grants for inland ports and rail infrastructure, aimed at connecting the Heartland's production centers directly to global shipping lanes. This infrastructure-first approach is seen as a way to provide a permanent competitive advantage that survives changes in political administrations or trade policies. As we move toward the final segments of this analysis, the focus remains on whether the Department of Commerce can successfully navigate the FDI shakeup. The current strategy is a high-stakes gamble that the United States can attract enough foreign capital and technology to rebuild its industrial base while simultaneously maintaining a protective tariff wall. For the people of Nebraska, the results of this strategy will be measured in the stability of their local economies and the viability of their family businesses. The dialogue between leaders like Fischer and Brown serves as a vital oversight mechanism, ensuring that the pursuit of national security does not come at the expense of economic opportunity. The goal is a balanced path forward where the Made in America label is a symbol of both domestic strength and global excellence. The journey toward this new economic reality is long, but the foundations are being laid in the legislative halls and the Department of Commerce offices today. As the legislative session of 2026 approaches its conclusion, the grand experiment of American economic decoupling has moved into its most critical phase of real-world implementation. Senator Fischer, standing before the committee with the poise of a seasoned advocate for the Plains, has synthesized the Republican vision into a firm call for what she describes as strategic patience. She argues that the structural foundations of a truly self-reliant America cannot be poured overnight without a significant risk of cracking under the pressure of global expectations. From the Nebraska perspective, the metric for success as we move into the final quarter of 2026 is no longer just the avoidance of a total agricultural collapse, but the successful transition into a bio-industrial powerhouse. This involves a shift away from the historical reliance on selling raw commodities like soybeans to a single, often adversarial, buyer in Beijing. Instead, Fischer champions the aggressive expansion of the domestic E15 biofuel market, which offers projects as a 2.5 billion bushel per year domestic demand sink. This move is designed to insulate American growers from foreign retaliation permanently by creating a closed-loop economy where Nebraska corn fuels American cars and stabilizes American energy prices simultaneously. On the opposing flank, Senator Sherrod Brown concludes his arguments with a sobering and data-driven look at the labor equilibrium of 2026, where the national unemployment rate is projected to hover around 4.5% amidst an anemic growth cycle. The Democratic critique remains sharply focused on the billionaire's tax cut and the persistent, sticky inflation induced by blanket tariffs, which they argue has created a permanent high-cost floor for every American household. Brown posits that the dignity of work cannot be realized if the much-vaunted resurgence of manufacturing is limited to automated dark factories that require a handful of specialized technicians rather than a robust middle-class workforce. He pushes for a radical and immediate expansion of the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, arguing that if the government is going to curate the winners and losers of the global economy through protectionist barriers, it must also provide a robust floor for those displaced by this reshoring transition. For Brown, the goal of 2026 is a labor market where the power balance finally shifts back to the worker, ensuring that Made in America is a promise of generational security rather than just a convenient corporate slogan. The Department of Commerce, acting as the ultimate architect and arbiter of this transition, is currently preparing its final reports for the 2022 to 2026 strategic cycle. The agency has organized its efforts around the 4 pillars of resilience: visibility, flexibility, collaboration, and automation. By late 2026, the department's supply chain center is expected to be fully operational, utilizing agentic AI to predict disruptions in critical minerals and foundational technologies months before they manifest as supply shortages. This technological shield is intended to prevent the recession-level employment shocks that have historically accompanied trade wars and sudden shifts in global alliances. As foreign direct investment continues to flow into regional hubs, driven by the long-term incentives of the CHIPS Act and the OBBBA, the department is betting that a new, more agile American industry will emerge. This industry will be one that doesn't just compete on the lowest price, but on its ability to innovate and deliver in a world where just-in-case logistics have replaced the fragile, high-risk, just-in-time models of the previous century. As the curtain falls on this extensive debate, the path for the American Heartland remains one of guarded optimism tempered by the reality of skyrocketing input costs and global supply gluts. The contrast between the current profitability of livestock and proteins versus the continued struggle of row crops suggests that Nebraska's future lies in high-tech processing and the value-added transformation of its raw materials on home soil. Whether viewed through the lens of Fischer's North American fortress or Brown's worker-centric trade enforcement, the consensus is that the old era of unfettered globalism is officially dead. The new era of sovereign productivity is still being born, and it is a birth marked by the labor pains of higher costs and shifting job descriptions. The 2026 fiscal year will likely be remembered not for a sudden hiring boom or a catastrophic bust, but for a stabilization of uncertainty, where the American worker and farmer finally gain a clearer view of the terrain ahead. Only by harmonizing the needs of the field, the factory, and the family can the nation hope to fulfill the promise of a resilient and prosperous 21st century economy. The dialogue between these two representatives serves as a vital oversight mechanism, ensuring that the pursuit of national security does not come at the expense of everyday economic opportunity. As the sun sets on the first year of this new trade paradigm, the focus remains on the tangible results for the people of the Midwest. The success of the America First legacy will ultimately be measured in the stability of the local bank ledger and the longevity of the town's manufacturing plant. While the macroeconomic debates continue in Washington, the real work of building a self-sufficient nation continues on the factory floors of Ohio and in the vast, fertile fields of Nebraska. The journey toward this new economic reality is long and fraught with challenges, but the foundations are being laid with a sense of purpose that transcends partisan rhetoric. The path forward is clear. A balanced, strategic, and human-centric approach to trade is the only way to ensure that the American dream remains viable in an increasingly fractured world.